Good morning from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. My name is Stephen Clark. I'm the editor of Spaceflight Now, and welcome to our live coverage of another SpaceX launch from here on Florida Space Coast. You're looking live at Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, around 4 miles away from our position here at Kennedy Space Center, where a Falcon 9 rocket, if you look closely, is vertical at Pad 40, awaiting liftoff this morning. That liftoff is set for no earlier than 4:22 a.m. Eastern Time, 9:22 a.m. UTC, carrying 56 more Starlink internet satellites into orbit. It is a rainy morning here at Kennedy Space Center. We've had rain off and on throughout the night. It was a little better earlier this morning when we were setting up our gear for this live broadcast with some more clear air, some overcast skies, but no rainfall. But the rainfall just resumed in the last few minutes, and that is obscuring our view right now a bit of Pad 40. But you can see the flashing lights on the lightning protection towers on each side of the Falcon 9 rocket, and the rocket is visible slightly amid the rainfall out at Pad 40. Now 55 minutes 25 seconds until the first opportunity to launch this mission this morning. There's a bit of uncertainty about the launch time. SpaceX had announced the target launch time of 4:22 a.m. Eastern Time, but we've also received reports of a possibility that they're going to be targeting 4:32 a.m. Eastern Time. We're going to stick with the countdown, and we'll bring you any official updates on the launch time. But right now, we're going to assume that the launch is still targeted for 4:22 a.m. Eastern Time. So that's why we went ahead and started our coverage. We apologize for the bit of a delay. There was the weather issue here. The weather issues here at Kennedy Space Center put us a bit behind schedule. We had to protect some of our equipment from the rainfall this morning. But if you're just joining us, thanks for doing so. We hope to bring you this launch of the Starlink 5-2 mission from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station this morning. Also, if you're just joining our coverage, please hit the like button, the thumbs up button on our YouTube stream. That helps us gain a larger following, a larger audience for our coverage. This will be SpaceX's 6th launch of the year and their 5th from here in Florida. They've launched one mission earlier this month from out at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. Again, this mission is set to deliver 56 more Starlink internet satellites into orbit. The next major milestone in the countdown will be coming at T-minus 35 minutes, about 18 minutes from now, when we expect or hope to hear from SpaceX on a go or no-go for propellant loading for the launch opportunity at 4:22 a.m. Eastern Time. T-minus 50 minutes, 25 seconds, and counting. After looking at the weather radar, the radar indicates that once this band of light rain passes through the area, there's not currently any rainfall behind it out to the west where these rain showers are moving in from. So we hope the skies will clear, and we hope to get a better visual of Pad 40 in the next few minutes to show you the Falcon 9 rocket as it counts down to liftoff this morning on SpaceX's 6th launch of 2023. And SpaceX has just confirmed, as we mentioned earlier, there was the possibility of the launch being delayed to 4:32 a.m., 10 minutes after the original announced launch time, and SpaceX has indeed just confirmed that the new target launch time this morning will be 4:32 a.m. Eastern Time, 9:32 a.m. UTC. So that's about 50 minutes from now. as we await the next major milestone in this morning's countdown, which is the start of propellant loading on the Falcon 9 rocket. We'll remind you, please, if you haven't done so, if you want to help us out, hit the thumbs up button or the like button on our stream here. That will help us gain a larger audience for our coverage. The rainfall has now cleared the area, and we're now getting a much clearer view of Pad 40 and the Falcon 9 rocket standing out there awaiting launch in 45 minutes. This will be SpaceX's 6th launch of the year and the 5th from here on Florida's Space Coast. Now 10.5 minutes from the start of propellant loading.
And tanks are venting for propellant load.
Pull for propellant load and launch is complete. We are go for propellant load and launch. This is LD briefing the abort instructions. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief the C or LD and they will approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operators shall call hold on countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch auto immediately and proceed into launch abort auto sequence. At T-minus 10 seconds and onwards, launch control will be hands-off and relying on automated abort criteria.
And the launch auto has started.
T-minus 32 minutes, 47 seconds. A few moments ago, we heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that propellant loading is getting underway out at pad 40. So the countdown is on track for liftoff at 4:32 a.m. Eastern Time, 9:32 a.m. UTC. You're looking again live at pad 40. If you're just joining us, we're expecting to see the launch of a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket at 4:32 a.m., 32 minutes from now. We're seeing a helicopter passing just behind the launch pad from our point of view. This is part of the standard pre-launch security sweep that the Coast Guard does, as well as the U.S. Space Force and Air Force, to make sure that the airspace and the waters around the Cape are clear of all non-essential personnel before a rocket is allowed to take off. T-minus 28.5 minutes. We're now seeing some of the vapors and condensation and frost beginning to build up on the first stage of the Falcon 9 rocket out at pad 40. This as liquid oxygen is loaded into that first stage. Liquid oxygen is chilled to cryogenic temperatures down to several hundred degrees below zero, near its freezing point. It's densified for use on the Falcon 9 rocket. So even colder than liquid oxygen that normally flies on other rockets, such as ULA's Atlas, Rocket Lab's Electron, as well as the Space Launch System from NASA. SpaceX uses even colder cryogenic liquid oxygen that allows more of the oxidizer to be loaded into the propellant tanks of both stages of the Falcon 9. The kerosene fuel is also densified, chilled closer to its freezing point, although not nearly as cold as the liquid oxygen. And we're seeing the frost build up on the outer skin of the first stage booster as this oxidizer is loaded aboard. Over the next few minutes, you may see the frost line on that first stage booster rise up the length of that first stage. That will indicate the progress of liquid oxygen loading on the booster stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. At the very bottom of the rocket, below where you're seeing that frost ring, is the kerosene tank, which is not a cryogenic tank. That's where the kerosene fuel is being loaded. So you won't see any frost be building up there. Right now, 3 of the 4 propellant tanks on the Falcon 9 rocket are being loaded. The upper stage liquid oxygen tank will still not be loaded until about T-minus 16 minutes. This mission will be carrying 56 Starlink internet satellites into orbit. These satellites are launching into a plane for the second generation Starlink constellation. So SpaceX has launched more than 3,700 Starlink satellites to date. The vast majority of those have gone into the first generation, or Gen 1 fleet, comprising 5 different orbital shells or pathways around the Earth at different altitudes and inclinations, all within the range of about 300 to 400 miles or 500 to 600 kilometers in altitude. This mission, Starlink 5-2, will be launching into a plane that was recently approved by the Federal Communications Commission for SpaceX's Gen 2 network, which will comprise at least, or up to, according to the FCC authorization, 7,500 satellites. The first mission launched into the Gen 2 fleet was back on December the 28th from here at Cape Canaveral. Another mission launching this morning with 56 more satellites on board. These satellites are very similar to the Gen 1 satellites. In fact, they appear to be virtually identical, if not completely identical, to the first generation satellites. Roughly the same size, shape, and mass. Each satellite weighs about a quarter ton. They provide broadband connectivity to more than 1 million customers that have signed up for SpaceX's Starlink service. The satellites are built at SpaceX's Starlink factory in Redmond, Washington. They will deploy solar panels after separating from the Falcon 9 rocket in orbit, and then use krypton-fueled ion engines to actually raise their altitude from the lower orbit that the Falcon 9 will place them in up to an operational orbit at 329 miles or 530 kilometers at an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. So that means these satellites will cover an area of the Earth between 43 degrees north and 43 degrees south. We've seen SpaceX launch satellites in the first-gen fleet to higher inclinations, 53 degrees, 70 degrees, even polar orbits to enable more global coverage. This launch into the 43-degree plane will help accelerate service to lower inclination or to lower latitude customers closer to the equator. This mission, we'll note, carries 56 Starlink satellites. The most recent mission that launched to the same orbit, Starlink 5-1 last month, carried 54 satellites. So we know that SpaceX has been tinkering and experimenting with some different flight mission profiles, as well as some different ways in which they load and utilize propellant on the Falcon 9 rocket to try to maximize the lift capability of the Falcon 9 rocket. We may be seeing that in work this morning with the 2 additional Starlink satellites on the stack inside the payload fairing. So there may be some engineering magic, so to speak, at work this morning with a slight increase in the Falcon 9's lift capability. If you're not familiar with the Starlink fleet or the Starlink network, it provides, again, global or near global at this point, soon to be global connectivity. for high-speed, low-latency internet service, and Starlink consumers who link up with the network with the satellites flying overhead use an antenna like this one connected with a modem to provide internet service in areas where traditional terrestrial fiber connectivity is not possible. 23 minutes, 8 seconds to go. We're about 3 minutes away from the so-called big vent that we'll see from the Strongback out at pad 40. That will be a milestone that will signal the transition from kerosene loading on the upper stage to the next phase of the countdown, which will be liquid oxygen loading on the second stage. This mission will be the 5th launch of the year from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. The Space Force projects around 87 launches, space launches from the Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral Space Force Station this year. That will be an increase if that number is met from the 57 launches that occurred last year in 2022, which, as you can see in this chart showing the launch cadence, launch rates over the last 20 plus years from the Cape. The 57 missions last year was a record. The vast majority of those in blue came from SpaceX, launch number 5 of 2023 on tap this morning. Now approaching T-minus 20 minutes and counting. We're seeing that big vent now visible out at pad 40.
Stage 2, RP1 load complete.
We just heard the call that we're streaming also on this live broadcast from SpaceX Launch Control that the stage 2 RP1 load is complete. So that's the kerosene fuel tank on the second stage, Rocket Propellant 1. That's what RP1 stands for. That loading of RP1 has been completed onto stage 2. What you're seeing now is a purge or vent from the Strongback to chill down the liquid oxygen line that will load oxidizer into stage 2 beginning in about 3 minutes. Loading of both propellants, kerosene and liquid oxygen, continues on the first stage. You can see closely if you look behind that plume of gaseous oxygen venting from the Strongback, you can see the frost level rising on that first stage liquid oxygen tank. T-minus 17 minutes. We expect to see that big vent terminate in the next few moments. That will coincide with the start of liquid oxygen loading onto the second stage. Again, this vent is associated with the conditioning of the liquid oxygen loading line that runs up the Strongback, where that oxidizer is then pumped into the upper stage. This thermally conditions that line for the loading of liquid oxygen into the upper stage. T-minus 16 minutes, 30 seconds. Here's a look at the countdown timeline this morning.
Stage 2 LOX load has started.
We just heard that the Stage 2 liquid oxygen loading has started, so we're seeing that vent now being terminated out at pad 40. We've already passed a few of these milestones on the countdown timeline. Propellant loading began at T-minus 35 minutes on 3 of the 4 tanks on the Falcon 9 rocket. Liquid oxygen just began loading moments ago onto Stage 2. Kerosene is already fully loaded onto Stage 2 at this point. In parallel with the propellant loading, cryogenic helium is also being loaded into the vehicle. This is a pressurant that is used to maintain pressure inside the propellant tanks as the fuel and oxidizer are consumed in flight. At T-minus 7 minutes, the Falcon 9 will begin chilling its engines for ignition. This is a thermal conditioning process to condition the 9 Merlin engines on the first stage for flight. At T-minus 5.5 minutes approximately, kerosene loading onto Stage 1 will be concluded. At that point, kerosene will be loaded onto both stages. And then at T-minus 4.5 minutes, the Strongback, the structure just to the right of the Falcon 9 out at pad 40, will recline just at a slight angle of about 1.5 degrees. That's where it'll remain for the rest of the countdown before swinging away in a more rapid motion at liftoff. At T-minus 2 minutes, liquid oxygen loading should be terminated. At that point, the Falcon 9 will be fully loaded with 1 million pounds of propellants. And then at T-minus 60 seconds, a critical milestone, that's the handoff of the control of the countdown from the ground launch sequencer computer, which is currently controlling the countdown, to the Falcon 9's own flight computer. That's the system that will oversee the final 60 seconds of the countdown. The SpaceX launch director will give their go for launch at T-minus 45 seconds. The propellant tanks will be brought to flight pressure, also in that last 60 seconds of the countdown. And then the engine start command will be issued at T-minus 3 seconds. Once those engines light and are throttled up to full power, the computer will run a quick health check to make sure all those engines are working properly, and then we'll give the command for 4 hold-down clamps, these hydraulic clamps at the base of the rocket where the rocket interfaces with the transporter erector Strongback thrust frame. Those clamps will release at T0, allowing the Falcon 9 to begin its climb into space. This mission will be heading off to the southeast from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This map shows the approximate ground track the Falcon 9 will be following. We mentioned earlier in our coverage that the mission will be targeting an orbit inclined 43 degrees to the equator. This mission will be heading southeast to reach that orbit. This red line shows the track of the first stage booster, which will fire about 2.5 minutes before jettisoning to begin a propulsive, controlled descent to the drone ship. Just read the instructions, parked about 400 miles or 660 kilometers southeast of the Cape, out in the Atlantic Ocean, northeast of the Bahamas. That's where that first stage will land about 8.5 minutes into the flight. The green line shows the trajectory or ground track that the upper stage will follow. After separating from the first stage, the upper stage will begin vectoring its thrust to make a slight right-hand turn, as you can see in this map, a dogleg maneuver that will ensure that it does not directly fly over any of the islands in any of the populated areas in the Bahamas or the Caribbean. And then we'll be heading southeast, passing over the Atlantic Ocean, just east of Puerto Rico, out over the Caribbean Sea, ultimately entering orbit about 8 minutes and 45 seconds or so into the flight. So this is the ground track for this mission, southeast, a southeast trajectory this morning for Starlink 5-2. We've talked a little bit about the timeline already, but 2.5 minute burn for the first stage, a standard profile for this launch, standard profile for any Falcon 9 launch. The second stage will then light while the first stage begins its return to Earth. The second stage will light its engine, a single engine, for a 6-minute burn to place the 56 Starlink satellites into their parking orbit. The payload fairing will jettison a few moments after second stage engine start. That will reveal the 56 Starlink satellites to the space environment for the first time. And then there's an entry burn plan using 3 of the engines in the first stage to help slow it down for reentry. And then at T plus 8 minutes and 44 seconds, we expect to see the landing of the 15-story tall first stage booster on the drone ship around the same time as the upper stage completes its main task this morning with a cutoff of that engine after arriving at a parking orbit. And then the Starlink satellites will begin separating from the Falcon 9 rocket nearly 19 minutes after liftoff. We don't anticipate to have any live video coverage of that event this morning. There may be a long wait for ground station coverage from SpaceX to confirm that those Starlink satellites have in fact deployed. But we'll bring that to you, if not on our live broadcast, we'll bring that to you on our social media feeds and on our website, spaceflightnow.com. We're going to go back to a full frame view here of Pad 40, 11 minutes from liftoff. If you're just joining us, please hit the thumbs up or the like button on our YouTube stream. That helps us gain a larger audience for our coverage. We want to bring this launch to as many people as possible. It's an exciting time here on the Space Coast with nearly 100 launches planned from Florida this year. Most of those will be conducted by SpaceX. Many of those SpaceX missions will be just like this one, very similar to this one, carrying Starlink satellites into orbit for their global broadband network. Minutes, 8 minutes 45 seconds. Everything continuing to track well for a liftoff at 4:32 a.m. Eastern Time, 9:32 a.m. UTC. Here's a look at the flight history for this booster. This mission will be using booster 1067 and SpaceX's inventory of reusable rockets. This mission will be the 9th flight of booster 1067. It debuted back on June the 3rd of 2021, about a year and a half ago now, on a cargo mission with a Dragon spacecraft heading to the International Space Station. It launched 2 astronaut crews as well, Crew 3 and Crew 4, each with 4 astronauts heading into the ISS for long-duration 6-month expeditions. It launched the Turkish Turksat 5B satellite back in December 2021, another space station cargo mission last summer in July, and then more recently a Starlink mission in September, and then a mission with Hotbird 13G, a Eutelsat TV broadcasting satellite in November, and then the most recent mission was December the 16th, with SES's O3B mPOWER 1 and 2 satellites, these satellites providing broadband service from orbit. Those 2 satellites launched from Pad 40 on this booster on December the 16th. The booster returned to a drone ship landing, much like it will this morning, for refurbishment, and then it's on the pad again now at Pad 40, awaiting a launch in 7 minutes.
Engines are chilling in for flight.
We just heard the confirmation from SpaceX Launch Control that the engine chill down is underway. So this involves flowing a small amount of liquid oxygen through the engine compartment to thermally condition the hardware for the more rapid flow to protect against thermal shock from that oxidizer as it flows into the engines at an engine startup. T-minus 6 minutes, 10 seconds. At this point also, the autonomous flight safety system on board the Falcon 9 rocket is being confirmed ready for flight. In the next few moments...
Stage 1 RP1 load complete.
That's just what I was about to say. In the next few moments, we just heard confirmation now that the first stage RP1 load is complete. So about 46,000 gallons of kerosene fuel now loaded into the Falcon 9 rocket. Liquid oxygen loading will continue down until about T-minus 2 minutes. This mission will be targeting an orbit about 131 by 209 miles in altitude. That's 212 by 337 kilometers and an inclination of 43 degrees. Again, we talked earlier about the trajectory to the southeast that the Falcon 9 rocket will take to reach this orbit. And then after releasing from the rocket, the Starlink satellites will actually use onboard engines, their own plasma thrusters, to maneuver to a higher orbit at about 329 miles before entering operational service. Now, inside of 5 minutes until launch, we're going to stand by for the next milestone, which will be the
Thanks, pressing for Strongback retract.
retraction of the Strongback out at pad 40. We're going to hand off now. I'm going to hand off now to my colleague Stephen Young, who will take you through the rest of the countdown, 4.5 minutes until liftoff.
Strongback lower has started.
You should now be seeing the retraction of the Strongback at Launch Complex 40. This provides propellant and power and ventilation feeds to the rocket. Being retracted to an angle of about 1.5 degrees. Ignition, it will fall back further as the rocket lifts off. And if you look closely, you can see that gap opening up between the Strongback and the rocket.
Stage 1 locks load complete.
You heard the call from SpaceX that the first stage liquid oxygen load is now complete. The rocket's destruct system is being armed. T-minus 2 minutes and counting. We'll be coming up on the ground closeouts. Could see some venting from the Strongback structure when that happens.
Stage 2 lock load complete. Gas launch closeouts.
Now the second stage liquid oxygen load is complete. Over 1 million pounds of fuel and liquid oxygen now aboard the vehicle. Seeing that venting from the Strongback. 1 minute and counting. Falcon 9 should be entering the startup phase where the onboard computers take control.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
There's the call from launch control. Falcon 9 has taken control. T-minus 40 seconds.
LD, go for launch.
There's the final go for launch from the launch director. Now be 20 seconds away from liftoff. Ten seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of the Falcon 9, carrying 56 Starlink satellites. Falcon 9 has cleared the tower. There is a low cloud deck at the Space Center today, so we'll see how long we can see the vehicle as it climbs skyward. Should be starting to hear the sound from the 9 Merlin engines very soon. And there it looks like the Falcon 9 has entered the cloud deck over the Space Center. Now taking live views from SpaceX. This comes with a little bit of delay. Now 1 minute into launch. SpaceX reporting everything nominal. Vehicle is reaching the point of maximum dynamic pressure. These views are coming from an onboard camera provided by SpaceX. Speed is a little over 10 seconds behind real time. Seeing beautiful shots of the exhaust from the 9 Merlin engines as it climbs and air pressure drops and that plume expands. Be coming up on separation of the first and second stages shortly. The view inside the rocket, we should see the separation.
Stage separation confirmed.
Audio confirmation, and there's visual confirmation of first and second stage separation and ignition of the upper stage engine.
Fairing separation confirmed.
View of the fairing now. We should see the separation shortly. There it goes. The split view coming from SpaceX shows first stage on the left side of the screen, the upper stage on the right side. First stage is still gaining altitude as it heads towards a drone ship stationed in the Atlantic Ocean. Eventually, it'll reach its peak altitude and start to descend. We're now 4 minutes into flight.
T plus 4.5 minutes into the flight.
Acquisition of signal, Bermuda.
This is Stephen Clark again. I want to thank Stephen Young for taking over the commentary at liftoff as I was operating the camera tracking the Falcon 9 rocket as it took off from pad 40. The upper stage is accelerated faster now than 10,000 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 166 kilometers, heading southeast, flying near the Bahamas now, 5 minutes into the flight. The first stage booster making its way back to Earth, targeting landing on the drone ship. Just read the instructions. Landing of the first stage about 3.5 minutes away. Everything looking good so far to start this mission. We saw the Falcon 9 climb through some cloud cover.
Both vehicles following nominal trajectories.
After taking off from pad 40. But that cloud cover, of course, did not obstruct the beautiful views we're seeing from the onboard cameras provided by SpaceX, showing the Merlin vacuum engine firing. Everything looking good according to SpaceX now. 5 minutes, 40 seconds into the flight. Coming up in about 30 seconds, less than 30 seconds now, will be the ignition of the three of the 9 engines on the first stage for the entry burn. This is a retro rocket burn to slow the rocket down as it dips deeper into the atmosphere. You can see on the map on the right the first stage making its descent. It's reached its maximum altitude on its suborbital arc. Second stage flying, again, northeast of the Bahamas, heading on a southeasterly course. We'll stand by for confirmation of the entry burn in the next few moments.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
We've heard confirmation, and
Stage
there
2
is
FTS is saved. Stage 1 FTS is saved.
there is visual confirmation of the entry burn. This will run about 15 to 20 seconds. The velocity, as you can see on the lower left of that first stage booster, decreasing with this braking
Stage
maneuver.
1 entry burn shutdown.
Both vehicles continue to follow nominal trajectories.
And there's confirmation of entry burn shutdown, about 1.5 minutes, 90 seconds until landing of the first stage. Around the same time, we expect to see and hear confirmation of the upper stage entering its transfer orbit.
Expected loss of signal, Cape.
Stage 1 is transonic.
Terminal guidance.
Stage 1 landing burn.
Landing burn underway.
Stage 1 landing
Drone
wing
ship
deploy.
in view.
Stage 1 landing is confirmed.
And SpaceX has confirmed landing of the first stage on the drone ship. Just read the instructions. Booster 1067
Convex shutdown.
has arrived on the deck of the drone ship floating about 400 miles downrange from the Cape. Great view there of this booster, a near bullseye for
Nominal
this
orbit
landing.
insertion.
Some venting there visible at the base of the first stage from the engine section. That's normal after a landing, as the booster runs through some automated procedures to safe itself to make sure all hazardous commodities are secured or vented overboard. Wonderful shot there of Booster 1067 completing its 9th flight to space. Meanwhile, in space, currently, the upper stage has entered its nominal transfer orbit after completing its 6-minute orbit insertion burn. A spectacular view of the orbital sunrise in the distance as the rocket heads to the southeast, now flying out over the Caribbean Sea, just southeast of Puerto Rico at this point, soon to head out over the Leeward Islands, the Lesser Antilles, and then out over the Atlantic Ocean heading toward South America, flying off the coast of Venezuela, French Guiana, and then over Brazil over the next few minutes. Deployment of the 56 Starlink satellites from the upper stage is expected at T plus 18 minutes and 49 seconds, about 8.5 minutes away from now. That deployment, we don't believe,
Expected loss of signal, Bermuda.
will occur during any ground station coverage. We just heard a loss of signal from the ground station in Bermuda. That's expected as the rocket flies out of range of that tracking site. SpaceX doesn't anticipate any ground station coverage to be able to receive any live telemetry from the rocket to confirm the deployment of the Starlink satellites. That confirmation will have to wait later this morning. Won't be too long, but once the rocket flies in range of another ground station further down range. We believe that might be over a ground station in Guam. This follows a identical mission profile as the last Starlink mission that launched from the Cape back on December the 28th. And for that mission, we had to wait about an hour after the launch for a ground station pass over Guam for SpaceX to be able to confirm that, yes, those satellites had deployed, everything was successful. So we're going to have to stand by for that, we expect, over the next few minutes to an hour. Perhaps before we receive the confirmation of Starlink deployment. 13 minutes, 50 seconds into the flight. Now about 5 minutes away from the expected time of spacecraft separation when the 56 Starlink satellites will be released from the Falcon 9's upper stage in orbit. To recap, the Falcon 9 successfully lifted off from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station at 4:32 a.m. Eastern Time, 9:32 a.m. UTC. This is SpaceX's 6th launch of the year, their 5th from Florida, and their 2nd dedicated Starlink flight of the year as well. The Falcon 9 first stage booster landed on the drone ship that's noted in the upper left on this Earth map near the Bahamas. That reusable booster completed its 9th flight to space this morning. The second stage successfully entered its expected parking orbit about 8.5 minutes into the flight and is now coasting and will soon be maneuvering to the proper orientation of or attitude for separation of the 56 Starlink satellites. However, that deployment event will occur while the rocket is not in range of a ground tracking station, so SpaceX Launch Control will not be able to receive any live data from the rocket during that event. That confirmation of spacecraft separation will have to come later when the rocket flies over another downrange tracking station. So we're not going to receive any live video. In fact, we don't even expect any verbal confirmation from telemetry from SpaceX of deployment until later. We expect that could take up to an hour before that confirmation is received for SpaceX to officially declare mission success this morning. This mission was the 199th flight of a Falcon 9 rocket since 2010. This is SpaceX's workhorse vehicle. Debuted back on June the 4th of 2010 and has now flown 199 times. This was the 209th launch overall for SpaceX's rocket family. This includes Falcon 1 rockets, the small satellite launcher now retired, as well as 5 flights of the Falcon Heavy, which is made by combining 3 Falcon 9 rocket first stage cores together. The 9th flight now complete for Falcon 9 Booster 1067. This was the 171st Falcon 9 launch from Florida, so 171 of the 199 missions have launched from Florida. This was the 111th SpaceX launch from Space Launch Complex 40, SpaceX's most used launch pad of their 3 active launch pads, and the 166th flight overall to depart from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral. This includes not only SpaceX launches, but the old Titan rocket family as well. The first launch from Pad 40 was back in 1965. And this was the 141st flight to utilize a reused Falcon 9 booster. This was the 167th successful landing of a Falcon booster. The 69th SpaceX launch, primarily dedicated with a primary purpose of launching Starlink internet satellites. The 6th SpaceX launch of the year and the 5th launch of the year from Florida's Space Coast. 50 plus 20 minutes into the Starlink 5-2 mission. At this point, the 56 Starlink satellites should have deployed from the Falcon 9 rocket in orbit. However, as we've mentioned, the rocket is not in range of a ground tracking station right now, so there's no live telemetry or live data from the launch vehicle being relayed to SpaceX engineers to be able to confirm that milestone. That will have to wait till they pass over a ground station later this morning. We anticipate that ground station pass will be over Guam, which is going to be nearly an hour from now before that confirmation will be able to be received to officially declare mission success for this launch of the Falcon 9 rocket. As you can see, the upper stage with the Starlink satellites now separated from that rocket, we believe, is passing over the Atlantic Ocean, having just flown over the easternmost point of Brazil. Before we sign off, we're going to look ahead, as we always do, at the launch calendar over the next couple of weeks. These are the missions through early February that we have confirmed target launch dates for. There may be other missions that could be occurring in this time frame that we don't have confirmation of launch dates yet, but these are the ones we can officially list that we've confirmed. The next launch of SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket is scheduled for Sunday, January the 29th, just 3 days away from out at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. This will be carrying a batch of Starlink satellites into orbit as well, targeting a higher inclination plane than this morning's mission, Starlink 2-6. Again, that launch will be occurring from the west coast out at Vandenberg Space Force Base, California. 2 days later, January 31st, 5 days from now, SpaceX's next launch from here in Florida is set to take off from Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center. That'll be a Falcon 9 rocket carrying the Starlink 5-3 mission. We expect that mission will be very similar to this morning's, carrying roughly 56 satellites to orbit, flying a similar southeast trajectory, we believe, although we haven't seen any airspace warning notices or notice to air missions or NOTAMs released regarding this mission yet on the 31st. But we expect to be back here at Kennedy Space Center covering that launch under very similar circumstances, a very similar mission to this morning on January 31st. That launch is currently set for a similar launch time as well at 3:27 a.m. Eastern Time, 8:27 a.m. UTC, so a very early morning or very late night, depending on where you are in the United States. On February the 5th, another Falcon 9 rocket is set to launch from Pad 40. This will be the next launch from Pad 40 down at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, carrying a high-power broadband geostationary communications satellite for Hispasat. It's a Spanish company. This satellite is called Amazonas Nexus. Also on February 5th, the first Russian space launch of the year is scheduled from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. This will be a Proton rocket carrying a Russian weather satellite called Electro-L number 4. This is the Russian equivalent of the U.S. GOES weather satellites, providing near real-time coverage of storms and weather systems. Of course, the Electro-L satellites cover Russian territory. We're going to sign off our live commentary at this point. We'll have confirmation later this morning on spaceflightnow.com and our social media channels of the outcome of the mission once we get some news from SpaceX on the confirmation of the spacecraft deployment event. Again, that will have to wait until ground station coverage is reacquired, likely nearly an hour from now over Guam. So we thank you for joining us for our live coverage this morning. I want to thank Stephen Young for video production and commentary support this morning. And want to thank you for tuning in again. Hope you'll join us next week for the launch of Starlink 5-3 from Kennedy Space Center. We'll have that live on our YouTube channel. And if you want to support our coverage, you can join our YouTube channel. We have different membership tiers available for you to choose from. Depending on which level you select, you can obtain access to exclusive members-only video features, and the revenue from this membership program helps us maintain and continue and expand our coverage. Again, I mentioned 87 launches from the Cape expected this year, 100 launches overall from SpaceX. We want to keep up with all that exciting activity, and you can help us do that by becoming a member of our YouTube channel. So until next time, I'm Stephen Clark, editor of Spaceflight Now, reporting live from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. We'll see you soon.